There's a country on the map right now, in the year 2026, where the calendar does not say 2026 at all, where an entire population goes to sleep every single night beneath a sky so dark that satellites orbiting hundreds of miles overhead can capture crystal clear images of neighboring nations glowing with electric light, while this one country sits as a black, empty void, as if it simply does not exist. Where the internet, the actual global internet that connects almost every human being alive, does not reach the average citizen at all, replaced instead with a tiny, closed-off imitation built entirely from scratch. Where your hairstyle can be dictated by law, where the class your grandparents belonged to 70 years ago can decide whether you are allowed to live in the capital city, and where an entire national holiday exists to celebrate a leader who has been dead for more than 3 decades but still, officially, technically, holds the title of president. This is North Korea, and once you start pulling apart the everyday details of life inside its borders, you stop finding a country that simply has stricter laws than everyone else and start finding a nation that built an entire alternate version of modern civilization almost completely disconnected from the rest of the world, with rules so specific and so strange that many of them genuinely do not exist anywhere else on Earth. The first thing that will completely reframe how you think about time itself is the fact that North Korea does not actually use the same calendar as the rest of the planet. While the majority of the world counts years based on the Gregorian calendar, North Korea officially operates on something called the Juche calendar, a system introduced in 1997 that resets the entire concept of year 1 to April 15th, 1912, the exact birth date of the country's founder, Kim Il-sung. That means while the rest of the world was living through the year 2026, North Korean state documents, newspapers, and official records were marking the year as Juche 115. Every single official document, every stamped form, every newspaper headline inside the country is dated according to this system, essentially meaning that an entire nation has organized its bureaucratic sense of time around the birthday of one man, a level of devotion baked directly into the literal date on the calendar that has no real equivalent anywhere else in the modern world. That devotion extends into something even stranger once you look at how North Korea actually defines its own leadership structure today. Kim Il-sung died back in 1994, more than 3 decades ago. And yet he was posthumously declared North Korea's eternal president, a title that has never been reassigned to anyone since. That means North Korea is, at least on paper, one of the only nations on the planet that could be described as a necrocracy, a government where a dead man technically remains head of state, while his son and grandson who followed him have only ever held the lesser titles of supreme leader, positioned as servants, continuing his eternal legacy rather than replacements for it. Portraits of both Kim Il-sung and his son Kim Jong-il are legally required to be displayed in nearly every North Korean household, and citizens are expected to keep them perfectly clean, hung at a specific height, away from direct sunlight, and free of any other decoration nearby. Because inspectors are known to make unannounced visits specifically to check on the condition and placement of these portraits. Damaging, disrespecting, or improperly displaying an image of the ruling family is treated as an extremely serious offense, and stories collected from defectors describe entire families risking their lives running back into burning buildings, specifically to rescue the framed portraits before saving anything else they owned. The third thing that separates North Korea from almost every other country on Earth is something you cannot even see if you are inside the country, but becomes instantly obvious the moment you look down from space. Satellite images taken at night consistently show the Korean peninsula split into 2 dramatically different halves. South Korea blazes with electric light, its cities glowing in dense, intricate patterns that stretch across the landscape. China glows brightly to the north and west, and sitting directly between them, North Korea appears almost completely black, a strange, empty void roughly the size of a small European country, with only a tiny pinprick of light marking the location of the capital city, Pyongyang. This is not a stylistic choice or an energy conservation initiative in the way it might be marketed elsewhere. It reflects a national electrical grid that has struggled for decades with chronic shortages, aging infrastructure, and international sanctions, limiting access to fuel and equipment, leaving huge stretches of the country functionally without reliable electricity after dark. It has become one of the most widely recognized visual symbols of North Korea's isolation, an entire nation rendered almost invisible from orbit, sitting in darkness while its neighbors shine. The fourth entry on this list involves something that sounds almost too strange to be real, a version of the internet that exists nowhere else on the planet. Ordinary North Korean citizens are not permitted access to the global internet that the rest of the world uses. Instead, the country operates something called Kwangmyong, which translates roughly to bright star, a domestic internet completely walled off from the outside world. It runs on pirated versions of older software, loads slowly, often over dial-up style connections, And when a foreign engineer accidentally gained access to its structure several years ago, investigators discovered the entire network contained fewer than 30 accessible websites. Most of these sites host government announcements, tightly controlled educational material, domestic news approved by the state, and a small selection of officially sanctioned entertainment. There is no path from Kwangmyong to the actual global internet for ordinary citizens. It exists as a completely separate, self-contained digital universe built specifically to give the appearance of connectivity while ensuring nothing resembling outside information or independent journalism can reach the general population. Only a small number of extremely high-ranking officials, estimated to be in the low thousands, are believed to have any access to the unrestricted global internet at all. The fifth thing that genuinely does not exist in this specific form anywhere else in the world is North Korea's hereditary caste system, known as Songbun. Every single North Korean citizen is assigned a social classification at birth, based not on their own individual achievements or behavior, but on the political history and perceived loyalty of their parents and grandparents dating back to the Korean War era. Depending on which source and time period you look at, the population is generally divided into a core loyal class, a much larger wavering or middle class, and a hostile class, further broken down into dozens of more specific subcategories used by internal security agencies. This classification, largely fixed and almost impossible to improve, through personal effort, quietly determines where a person is legally permitted to live, what kind of job they are allowed to hold, which university they might be permitted to attend, how much food they are prioritized to receive during shortages, and even who they are realistically allowed to marry, since families with strong Songbun are generally unwilling to let their children marry into a family with a weaker classification. It is a system so deeply woven into the structure of daily life that most citizens are said to learn their own status only gradually, through the compounding pattern of doors that quietly do not open for them throughout their lives. That same system directly connects to the sixth strange reality of life in North Korea, which is that ordinary citizens cannot simply choose to live in the capital city. Pyongyang functions almost like a separate gated country within the country, reserved primarily for the political elite, top military families, skilled specialists deemed useful to the state, and citizens with strong enough Songbun classifications to earn approval. Moving into Pyongyang legally requires a specific residence authorization tied to security agencies, government offices, and the ruling party, and citizens from lower classifications are generally barred from even entering the city without special travel permits, let alone living there. Unauthorized residency, when discovered, can lead to forced relocation, back to the provinces, or more serious punishment. This has effectively created two very different versions of North Korea existing simultaneously. The curated, relatively well-resourced capital city that foreign visitors and journalists are typically shown, filled with wide boulevards, monuments, and relatively modern apartment towers, and the much poorer, more restricted rural provinces that make up the overwhelming majority of the country's actual land and population, which outside visitors are rarely permitted to see in any meaningful detail. The seventh entry brings the list down to something almost mundane on the surface, but genuinely bizarre once you understand how strictly it is enforced, and that is the North Korean approach to hairstyles. The state has published an official, limited list of government-sanctioned hairstyles that citizens are expected to choose from, with reports describing somewhere around 18 approved options for women and roughly 10 for men. Styles considered too long, too short, too closely associated with Western fashion trends, or simply too unusual compared to the approved list, can lead to a citizen being stopped, questioned, or in some documented cases, having their hair forcibly cut by authorities on the spot. Even senior members of the Kim family are said to have their own distinct, instantly recognizable hairstyles that ordinary citizens are specifically discouraged from copying, treating certain haircuts as something close to a visual symbol reserved exclusively for leadership. It stands as one of the most oddly specific examples of state control, extending into a part of daily life that almost every other country on Earth treats as a completely ordinary personal choice. The eighth thing that exists almost nowhere else in the world in quite this form is North Korea's use of traffic ladies, a role that has become one of the most photographed and internationally recognized symbols of the country. Rather than relying primarily on traffic lights at many major intersections in Pyongyang, the state employs young women, generally required to be unmarried and under the age of 26, dressed in sharp, precisely tailored uniforms, to direct vehicle and pedestrian traffic using crisp, almost theatrical hand and body movements. The position is treated as genuinely prestigious inside North Korea, reserved for young women considered to have both an ideal, appearance and strong political reliability, and it comes with surprising honors attached. In 2013, one traffic lady reportedly received one of the country's highest military honors, specifically for her disciplined performance directing traffic, an achievement that would sound almost satirical in most other countries, but is treated with complete sincerity inside North Korea as a legitimate, celebrated form of national service. The ninth entry on this list is the country's approach to basketball, which North Korea has quietly modified into a version of the game that exists nowhere else on the planet. While the sport is played with mostly standard rules on the surface, several unusual scoring adjustments have been documented in matches played inside the country. Reports describe rule variations where a standard shot might be worth its usual points, but a 3-point shot can be awarded significantly more, with some accounts describing values as high as 8 points under specific rule sets used domestically, alongside additional adjustments like point penalties for missed free throws or bonus points awarded for dunking. The exact rule combinations have varied across different reported matches and exhibitions over the years, but the consistent pattern is a version of an internationally standardized sport that has been deliberately altered inside North Korea's borders, producing a chaotic, unusually high scoring style of play that looks distinctly different from basketball anywhere else in the world. There is also a widely documented practice inside North Korea that has essentially no equivalent in most modern economies. A system of mandatory, largely unpaid labor mobilizations that citizens are expected to participate in on top of their regular jobs. Workers, students, and even school children are routinely called upon to contribute. Additional labor towards state construction projects, agricultural campaigns during planting and harvest seasons, and elaborate preparations for national celebrations and military parades, often organized under sweeping national campaigns given dramatic revolutionary names. Participation is technically framed as a voluntary expression of loyalty to the state, but defectors describe it as functionally mandatory, with absence or refusal noted, tracked, and potentially held against a person's broader political standing. Combined with regular attendance at self-criticism sessions, where citizens and co-workers are expected to publicly confess their own shortcomings and gently critique the shortcomings of colleagues in a show of ideological discipline, it adds yet another layer to a daily life already shaped by the state at nearly every level, where even how a person spends their evenings and weekends is frequently organized around demonstrating visible loyalty rather than personal choice. Before reaching that final entry, it is worth pausing on one more restriction that most outsiders never think to ask about, which is that North Korean parents are not entirely free to name their own children however they wish. The names Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il themselves are effectively off limits for ordinary citizens, treated as names so closely tied to the sacred status of the ruling family, that using them for an ordinary baby would be considered deeply inappropriate, bordering on disrespectful. Reports from defectors and researchers studying the country describe additional informal pressure, discouraging names that sound too foreign, too closely tied to South Korean naming trends, or too obviously borrowed from Western culture, reinforcing the same broader pattern seen throughout the rest of this list. An environment where even the most personal individual choices a family might make are quietly shaped by the state's constant concern about outside cultural influence and appropriate displays of loyalty. It is a small detail compared to some of the others on this list, but it captures something important about how thoroughly this particular brand of control reaches into daily life, touching not just what citizens wear, watch, or where they are permitted to live, but the very first word ever spoken to describe them. The 10th and final entry on this list is arguably the most quietly disturbing, because it is not a quirky cultural adaptation or an unusual rule change, but a formal legal principle that has shaped the fate of entire families for generations. North Korea's legal and security system operates under a doctrine widely referred to as the rule of 3 generations, under which a serious political offense committed by one individual, particularly anything considered disloyalty toward the state or the ruling family, can result in punishment extending to that person's children and grandchildren as well, regardless of whether the younger generations had any involvement in the original offense at all. This principle has been directly linked by human rights investigators and defector testimony to the country's system of political prison camps, where entire extended families, including small children born decades after the original offense took place, have reportedly been imprisoned together under the belief that disloyalty itself can be treated as something hereditary, passed down through bloodlines the same way Songbun classification is. It represents one of the starkest examples on this entire list of a rule that genuinely has no direct equivalent inside the modern legal framework of virtually any other nation on earth, a formal, institutionalized belief that guilt is not necessarily limited to the person who commits an act, but can be inherited by their descendants for generations afterward. Somewhere between the traffic ladies and the basketball court sits an entire category of restriction that rarely makes headlines outside North Korea, but shapes daily life just as thoroughly, and that is the state's approach to clothing. Denim jeans, in particular, have been widely reported as effectively banned for ordinary citizens, treated by the government as a visible symbol of American culture and Western capitalism, something considered ideologically unacceptable for a population that is constantly reminded of the state's rivalry with the United States. Reports from defectors and outside researchers describe similar restrictions extending to other clearly Western-styled clothing, tight-fitting garments, visible piercings, and unusual jewelry, all of which can attract unwanted attention from local inspection groups who patrol streets specifically looking for violations of the country's dress code. Even the color and cut of a coat can occasionally draw scrutiny if it deviates too far from what is considered acceptable, and this extends specifically and severely to anything resembling South Korean fashion trends, which the state treats as a particularly dangerous form of cultural contamination given the ongoing political tension between the two Koreas. Ordinary citizens caught wearing clearly foreign-styled clothing, especially anything associated with South Korean pop culture, have reportedly faced fines, public criticism sessions, or worse, depending on how the offense is classified by the officials who catch them. Clothing is only one piece of a much larger campaign against outside cultural influence, and nowhere is that campaign taken more seriously than around foreign media itself. Possessing, distributing, or even watching smuggled South Korean television dramas, films, or K-pop music videos is treated as an extremely serious crime inside North Korea, a stark contrast to almost anywhere else, on an Earth where watching a foreign television show is a completely unremarkable daily activity. In recent years, the government has passed increasingly severe laws specifically targeting this kind of content, with defector testimony and outside legal analysis describing potential punishments that include hard labor, imprisonment in political prison camps, and in the most serious documented cases involving mass distribution, execution. Simply speaking with an accent or using slang associated with South Korea has reportedly been enough to draw suspicion in some documented cases, since the state treats linguistic drift as an early warning sign of deeper cultural influence taking hold. It is a level of enforcement around entertainment media that has essentially no parallel anywhere else in the modern world, where a single smuggled flash drive full of foreign dramas can end up treated with the same severity as a serious act of political subversion. There is also the matter of how North Korea handles its national television broadcasting for the citizens who never encounter any of this smuggled content at all. Ordinary households have access to only a small handful of officially sanctioned television channels, all of them state-operated, all of them airing programming that has been reviewed and approved specifically to reinforce loyalty to the ruling party and the Kim family. Radios and television sets sold or distributed inside the country have often been modified so that they are physically incapable of receiving unauthorized foreign broadcast frequencies, permanently fixed to state-approved channels only. Citizens caught tampering with these devices to access outside broadcasts face the same category of serious punishment associated with other forms of banned foreign media. Combined with the extremely limited version of the internet available through Kwangmyong, this creates a media environment where the average North Korean citizen genuinely has almost no practical way to access independent information about the outside world, or in many documented cases, an accurate picture of their own country's history and current events either. And then there is one of the most visually striking and strange traditions in the entire country, a massive coordinated performance event known as the Mass Games, sometimes staged under the title Arirang. Tens of thousands of performers, often including school children who have trained for months in advance, gather in a single stadium to perform an enormous, tightly synchronized display combining gymnastics, dance, and a card stunt technique where thousands of individuals hold up colored placards in perfect unison, flipping them in coordinated sequence to form massive shifting images and political slogans across an entire stadium wall, essentially turning a crowd of human beings into a giant living pixel display. These events, performed to celebrate national anniversaries and the achievements of the ruling party, require an extraordinary level of rehearsal and discipline, with performers, including very young children, drilled repeatedly over weeks or months to achieve the kind of split-second precision the performance demands. Outside observers who have been permitted to attend have described the visual spectacle as genuinely stunning to witness, while human rights researchers have raised serious concerns about the intensity of training imposed on child performers involved in producing it. Another example of how thoroughly North Korea blends genuine spectacle with an underlying structure of rigid mandatory discipline. Of a country that has not simply enforced stricter versions of laws that exist everywhere else, but has constructed an almost entirely separate operating system for daily life, covering everything from the calendar on the wall to the internet on the screen to the class a newborn baby is quietly assigned before they can even speak. Most of what has been documented here comes from a patchwork of sources, satellite imagery analyzed by outside researchers, testimony collected from North Korean defectors who risked their lives to leave, investigations conducted by international human rights organizations, and the carefully limited observations of the small number of foreign journalists and tourists who have been permitted to visit under tightly controlled conditions. Because North Korea remains one of the most closed-off nations on the planet, some specific details inevitably shift or get disputed between different sources, and first-hand access to verified daily life outside the curated capital remains extremely limited for outsiders. But the consistent pattern across every independent source, defector accounts, satellite data, leaked internal documents, and outside journalism all point in the exact same direction, describing a nation that built its entire society around control so total and so specific that it reaches into the calendar, the haircut, the internet connection, and the very bloodline of every single person living inside its borders. Taken all together, these 10 realities paint a picture of a country that has not simply enforced stricter versions of laws that exist everywhere else, but has constructed an almost entirely separate operating system for daily life, covering everything from the calendar on the wall to the internet on the screen to the class a newborn baby is quietly assigned before they can even speak. Most of what has been documented here comes from a patchwork of sources: satellite imagery analyzed by outside researchers, testimony collected from North Korean defectors who risked their lives to leave, investigations conducted by international human rights organizations, and the carefully limited observations of the small number of foreign journalists and tourists who have been permitted to visit under tightly controlled conditions. Because North Korea remains one of the most closed-off nations on the planet, some specific details inevitably shift or get disputed between different sources, and first-hand access to verified daily life outside the curated capital remains extremely limited for outsiders. But the consistent pattern across every independent source, defector accounts, satellite data, leaked internal documents, and outside journalism all point in the exact same direction, describing a nation that built its entire society around control so total and so specific that it reaches into the calendar, the haircut, the internet connection, and the very bloodline of every single person living inside its borders.